All right, SLA students, welcome to your asynchronous interactions hypothesis SLA lesson. And let's get right to it. I hope you're comfortable and everybody has their coffee handy and you brought your thinking caps with you, so to speak. Okay, so we're going to begin just like any other lesson, except you have a task document to complete as you watch this video. And I will guide you through that, so you'll be able to complete those tasks as I cover the content of the lesson itself. Okay, so Long's interaction hypothesis. Now, before we begin, it's important to remember the work of Swain, okay, because Krashen and Swain both heavily influenced Long in Long's interaction hypothesis, and you can see the influence throughout. So as I'm doing this, see if you can answer by yourself before the answers are revealed. Okay, so our goal here is just to explain the process of second language acquisition according to Swain's theory of pushed output. Now remember that pushed output is really just an expected level of output that would be a bit beyond what the learners can produce on their own naturally, right? So if I+1 was comprehensible input for Krashen, just a bit beyond that level I, which is the level of input that the learners can already understand, then I+1 was a little beyond that. O+1 is output just beyond the level that the learners can produce on their own. So Swain said that pushed output leads to this in a second language by creating an environment where the learners can experience the functions of output. Now for this one, it's a little bit tricky, but right now as you're watching the video, what do you think goes in the blank? Take a moment to think about that, and feel free to pause while you think. I will reveal the answer, but it's always better to elicit, which is asking you to do some cognitive work, as we talked about in SLA and you've heard in methodology and practicum. Alright, so pushed output leads to what Swain called intake. Now if you said acquisition here, that would be fine. Acquisition, intake of course is where that new knowledge, or in this case that new language knowledge, is kind of uploaded to the brain and it becomes part of yours, part of your repertoire, if you will, of language that you acquire, language that you understand, language that you can use. So if you said understanding, if you said development, if you said something like that, it would be acceptable, but intake is the word that Swain uses a lot. So what are the functions of output? Take a moment to think to yourself what those functions were. We talked about it a lot in class, but it always helps to review. That first function of output, I don't know if you have them in this order, is the fluency function of output. And basically what that's saying is that Swain says you have to push output for learners to have the opportunity to develop and improve their speed, improve their efficiency through practice. So again, Krashen is not asking for that. Krashen is not saying we need to push output. Krashen says that your output is going to come kind of naturally. Swain says they need a little push, and that's how they're going to develop these 4 functions. One of them is fluency. And the next one, everyone's favorite, hypothesis testing. So trying out new language, receiving feedback, and that feedback becomes intake. So we can think of it in terms of just trying language for the first time, or you're trying to use something that you think is appropriate in that situation. And sometimes our hypothesis as a language learner is correct. Maybe I say this in this situation, whatever that is. The example I often used was in a taxi in Korea, right? 자회전? 우회전? 오른쪽? You're trying different things to see what works. And remember too that feedback that you get is not necessarily something formal like you get from a teacher. Okay, it's just some kind of indication that you're understood, right? In the case of the taxi, maybe they just turned because you said something they understood. Another good point here is they could understand what you mean even if you're not accurate, so the feedback could be just that you made yourself understood rather than whatever you said was totally accurate, right? And the other thing that happens with hypothesis testing is, of course, we make mistakes. You try something, it's wrong, and the feedback you get is that that's not what you say in this situation. So that becomes intake too. It's kind of linguistic knowledge at that point. And another function of output for Swain was consciousness raising, which has another phrase that goes with it. And that phrase, of course, is noticing the gap. So through the process of producing output, which is happening here as a result of the teacher pushing output, perhaps, the student becomes aware, the language user becomes aware of what they can say and what they want to say. And can you imagine, in Krashen's case, when would that happen for a learner? They become aware of what they can say and what they cannot say. Well, Swain is saying it doesn't happen if all you're getting is comprehensible input. You need to be put in that situation. You need to be encouraged to produce output so that you become aware of your gap, right? And the other important thing about consciousness raising is that the input that you seek to close the gap becomes your intake. So whereas in hypothesis testing, you try something out, and as a result of that, you receive feedback, the consciousness raising function, you're producing output so you realize what you can't say. You realize the difference between what you can say and what you want to say. And so you might ask a question, or you might seek that feedback in other ways, rising intonation, looking helpless, whatever it is. And then when you get that input from the other person or from whoever they are, that input becomes that linguistic knowledge that goes in as intake. And speaking of linguistic knowledge, let's not forget the meta-linguistic function of output. So when we're talking about meta-language, that's language about language, right? So when you use words like, oh, that's an adjective, that's an adverb, that's a noun, so parts of speech, or even when you're talking about phrases or sentences or questions, whatever it is that you're describing, when you're describing that language unit, rather than just talking, right? When you're describing language as language, that's meta-language. Now, the meta-linguistic function is basically saying that when you're pushed to produce output, some of the things that happen, you're probably going to reflect on how you used output afterwards, and you could talk to somebody about your language use. Now, you could be using meta-language there, like, oh, I used an adjective, I should have used an adverb, I forgot my article, whatever it was, that's meta-language. Or you could just be talking about how you use language without using those language terms. You could say, oh man, why did I say that? You know, like my example of the job interview. Everybody has a moment later where they're kind of kicking themselves about something they said. All of that is considered reflection. Additionally, self and peer correction. Now, we haven't covered these techniques much in the program yet, but what you'll learn is that self-reflection and particularly self-correction is very much a reflective process, because what the teacher is doing is the teacher says, okay, you said this, you know, maybe put it on the whiteboard. You want to try that again? And so it forces the student to then kind of think about how they use language. So in that sense, it's meta-linguistic, right? It's reflective about language use. Peer correction, yes and no. You know, you can kind of reflect based on what your peer tells you about what you said, but I always find that when you guide someone to notice their own error, that's much more reflective, and that's much more meaningful. In any case, all these reflective processes lead to the knowledge about language that becomes intake. Okay, and this is why Swain says we have 4 functions, right? Okay, so what's the difference between Krashen and Swain? Well, let me put myself in the middle there. So you can think about this a little bit before continuing the video if you like, because I'll just reveal. Krashen, of course, said we need to lower the affective filter, we need to provide ample comprehensible input, so lots and lots of I+1, no need to push output, because learners are going to produce output when they're ready. And they go through a silent period as they are receiving that comprehensible input, and one day they kind of produce on their own. So that was one of Krashen's key points. And Swain said, you know what? Of course comprehensible input is important, but we must also push output to help learners to develop productive skills and overall proficiency. Okay, so once again, don't make the mistake that Swain was absolutely anti-Krashen. Swain is building off of what Krashen said, right? Swain is saying, I+1, I like that. That fits with my own ideas about language acquisition, but I'm also going to point out that output deserves just the same amount of attention as input does for Krashen. Which brings us to Long's interaction hypothesis. So you can think of it in this way. You can think of input plus output equals interaction. You're going to see a lot of similar things here. You'll see something that's a little bit different. Now, in your individual task slide, you have some questions, okay? Questions like, what is language breakdown? Why does it happen? Okay, language breakdown is something that, of course, Long talks about. How can this be a good thing for language students? And I have a little hint there. Krashen plus Swain is Long. It could be a good thing. I don't know if that helps you. You could put your own ideas about why that could be a good thing for language students. And another major concept for Long was, of course, negotiation of meaning. And what is that? How could it be useful for language acquisition? And while you're doing this, you want to press pause and then continue the video only after you've done this with your notes. And just a little reminder, if you don't push pause, if you just kind of listen to the answers and then write those down, that's not going to help you to learn. So I really encourage you to look at your notes from the reading, push pause here, take some notes in your task slide, and then check what the answers are in the video. And don't worry about the wrong answers in the task slide. That doesn't matter at all. You just need to complete it while you watch this. So just do your best, push pause while you do, because I'm about to reveal the answers. Alright, you pushed pause, you put your notes in your task slide, and now the reveal. No peeking if you haven't done it already. You want to make sure to get in there and edit your task slide. So, our first one, what is language breakdown? Well, one way to think of it is it's kind of a moment of communicative failure. So language stops to work for a speaker. It happens when the communicative demands are a little bit higher than the speaker's ability to understand and express herself. And if you just think of the word breakdown, what kinds of things break down in the world other than language? You can hit pause while you think, if you like. What breaks down? Cars break down, right? Machines break down. We talk about cars breaking down a lot. We talk about people having an emotional breakdown. That's a little different. But when something breaks down, it stops working. And that's exactly what happens with language breakdown. So you reach a point where your language skills are not enough to express yourself in that context, right? So sounds pretty grim, but remember that Long is saying it's kind of a good thing, which brings us to our next question. Next question, oops, one at a time. Next question, how can this be a good thing for language students? Well, Swain says that language breakdown must happen to trigger this negotiation of meaning. Negotiation of meaning, which we're going to talk about in a moment, negotiation of meaning is essential for language acquisition, and it's not going to happen unless there's breakdown. You can think of it this way. If you know what to say, if you can express yourself perfectly, you understand everything, then you're not really developing, right? There's no reason to go through a negotiation of meaning if you understand everything. You can think of it as I+1 plus O+1 equals interaction, and students learn through this process. So if you see some similarities with Swain, you're not alone. They are, of course, linguists. They know each other, and there's some very similar ideas, but the idea of negotiation of meaning through interaction is very much associated with Long. So what is the negotiation of meaning? After language breakdown, or you can think of it as a result of language breakdown, speakers are going to engage in these three interactive moves. You can think of them as moves. And those three we're going to talk about a bit later. That's comprehension checks, clarification requests, and confirmation checks. So, is the speaker making sure that the other person is following? That's a comprehension check. And as I'll mention later, this is not the same as what a teacher does after giving instructions. Yes, that's a kind of comprehension check, but that's not what every pair of speakers is going to do. That's not the way everyone does it. So something like "do you understand" would be fine in that context, where we discourage you from using that as a classroom comprehension check. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Clarification requests. Sorry, I need some more information. Right? Can you clarify for me? And confirmation checks. Did I understand you correctly? Right? And you'll see examples of that in a moment. Okay. So in your individual task slide, this is another task for you to complete. Exactly what are clarification requests, confirmation checks, and comprehension checks in your own words, okay? And what's going to happen again is you're going to hit pause while you do that. Please hit pause. You're going to go into your task slide and you're going to write your own answers. If you like, I will share task slides, what they look like. So far you will have done the first slide, what is language breakdown, how can it be a good thing, etc. You did the first slide and then you checked your answers in the video. Hopefully that's the procedure you went through. Next you have right here clarification requests, confirmation checks, and comprehension checks. In your own words, what are they? And then I'll guide you to the next one. Okay, so you've hit pause and you have typed your answers. Now these are, what are they? They are tools or moves for negotiating meaning. Okay, I said a little bit about this earlier. Okay, clarification requests. One speaker asks for explanation, asks for more information. It could be something like, huh? I'm sorry, what do you need? Right? It could be like, could you tell me something? Could you say that a different way? Right? You just didn't understand and you're asking the other person to clarify. Now, I should say that this is not always going to be something that happens with a language learner and a native speaker. You probably do it in Korean with fellow Koreans a lot. Like, huh? What are you saying? 뭐라고요? Huh? So you're going to clarify. You ask for clarification a lot. So that's one of the ways we negotiate meaning. And our second one we're checking, because you already wrote this in your task slide. Confirmation checks. As I mentioned briefly earlier, one speaker is confirming that what they heard is in fact what the other person said. So what they heard or understood is right. So maybe something like, you mean I should take out the trash? That's what, I just want to make sure I understand you. Okay, and this is something that happens a lot, right? And it only happens through interaction, and it only happens for long after this language breakdown. If that language breakdown didn't happen, there's no need to do this, right? In other words, what would you be clarifying? What would you be confirming? That's Long's idea. Okay, and our last one here, I'll go ahead and bring this one down. Comprehension checks. Everyone's favorite, right? We use this term a lot in the TESOL program, but a confirmation check, one speaker is just making sure that the other speaker understood, right? So, are you following? Do you understand? Do you know what I mean? And sometimes do you know what I mean is just kind of a discourse marker, kind of a filler, but sometimes it's a real question. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does this make sense, what I'm saying? You're just making sure they understand. And again, that's, if you say, do you understand? It's perfectly fine in this context. We don't want you using that in the classroom, though, because we know as language teachers that we want our students to demonstrate understanding, and you don't want them to just say, I understand, right? But these are the 3 tools for negotiating meaning, according to Long. All right, this brings us to a study. This is actually from a paper that came out years ago, but it shows this negotiation of meaning, right, that Long is talking about. And you have a task associated with this in your slides, your individual task slides. But let me take you through it so you can understand the interaction that's taking place, and then you can do the task. So what happens is you have a native speaker and a non-native speaker, and the native speaker is trying to guide this non-native speaker to do a certain task involving a duck and a truck. Okay? Whack, whack. All right, so, and the native speaker says, and right on the roof of the truck, place the duck. And the non-native speaker says, I to take it? Dog? And then the native speaker says, the duck. 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 Okay, native speaker says, you know, it's yellow and it's a small animal. It has 2 feet. I don't know if they're using gestures, but I would. I put where it? Native speaker. You take the duck and you put it on top of the truck. Duck? Okay, no. You take the duck and you put it on top of the truck. Do you see the duck? Non-native speaker. Duck? Yeah. Quack, quack. Quack, quack, quack. That one. The one that makes that sound. Yes. Yes, I see. I see in the head of him. Okay. Okay, see? Yes, I see in the head of him. Okay, put him on top of the truck. Put what? Truck? The bus, where the boy is. Yes. Okay, so hopefully you can kind of understand what's happening here, because your task is this. Okay? You are going to, in your individual task slides, you're going to look at the A's and the B's and the C's. They are examples of certain kinds of negotiation of meaning moves, right? And you're just going to cut and paste or copy and paste the emoji that goes with each one. Clarification request is an alien for no reason, okay? Confirmation check is a monkey, and so on. Okay, so pause the video and make sure you cut and paste those into your slide. Tick tock, tick tock. You have done that task now and you're ready to check your answers. Okay, let's check because you have done that. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. So the A's, well, those are confirmation checks. The B's are clarification requests, and the C's are comprehension checks. Let's think about why that is. Okay, so A is a confirmation check. Look at each one of these. The speaker is trying to make sure that they understood right. I take it, right? A dog? That's what you said, right? Or down here, duck is what you said, right? Or down here, put what? Put what? No, sorry, that should be a little bit lower. At the truck. Truck. That's, that is a confirmation check. Did you say truck? Okay. And then if we look at B, if we look at each B, those B's are clarification requests. We're asking for more information. I put where, what? I put where it? Put what? I will lower these, the letters in the slides for you before I post. So we're asking for more information. Put what? I put where it. That's a clarification request. And C's are comprehension checks. And notice it should be no surprise that the C's are all on the left side, because the person who is more proficient is the one who's asking comprehension checks typically, right? So, do you see the duck? That's a comprehension check. I want to make sure that you're following. I want to make sure that you understand. Do you see what I'm talking about? Do you see the duck? And then see down here. Okay, see? It's kind of trying to make sure you're following what's going on. All right. So that was your other task in your task slides. And if you're interested in the academic explanation of these, you have it right here at the bottom of this slide. Confirmation checks, moves by which one speaker seeks confirmation of the other's preceding utterance through repetition with rising intonation or what was perceived to be, etc., etc., etc. Okay, you can read that if you're interested. It's very academic, linguistic-y talk. Okay. And there it is again, if you're interested. Which brings us to our next task in your individual task slides. So I've given my definition of each of these so you don't have to do that part. But all I want from you is your own example of each. Okay? Your own example of what could be a clarification request. You might have to think of a kind of context where you're talking to someone about a certain topic. Might be hard to do it abstractly, but think of your own context, and then you can write one question for each, for example. So one example of a clarification request, one example of a confirmation check, one example of a comprehension check. Now, the one exception I'm going to say here, the one caveat, is that please don't write what are we going to do as your comprehension check. We're not looking for a classroom comprehension check, but think of a casual conversation. Okay, you've met somebody from Bangladesh and you're trying to talk to them in English, and you have a little language breakdown, so you're asking them certain questions, or you're making sure that they understand, or you want them to make themselves more clear. Okay, something like this. All right, so I don't have answers to reveal, so you could pause right here and do that if you like. And now, just as a review, clarification requests, confirmation checks, and comprehension checks, they are used to, you can say it right now if you want, this is the space where I'm going to let you say it, they are used to, now how many of you spoke to your screen right now? That would be really cool. They're used to negotiate, Mexican food, no, meaning, they're used to negotiate meaning. As you know, just a bit of review. So, if Long's theory is true, what are the classroom implications, guys? What do you think? What can we do in the classroom if this is true? Well, let me take that away. Take a moment to think. Take a moment to think, what are the classroom implications if Long's theory is true? What should we be doing as teachers? What conditions should we have in our classroom? Pause to think, and then unpause. Well, as teachers, we need to encourage the negotiation of meaning, right? And so, what does that mean? Well, we should facilitate language breakdown. So remember, language breakdown for Long is a good thing. If it doesn't happen, then that negotiation of meaning doesn't happen. How do we do that? Well, we do it with the right amount of I+1 and O+1. Okay? We've got to keep challenging the students, keep challenging your students so that they're in a position where they have to ask clarification requests, right? where they have to ask each other comprehension check questions. Do you know what I'm saying right now? Right? That kind of situation. And I should add, this works best when you have a pair of students who are, one is higher proficiency, right? Because you need someone, need someone kind of to challenge them. You can do it with other students who are about the same, as long as they are, engaged in the right kind of conversation. So here's a related question, everybody. What kind of interaction is best? What do I mean by best? What kind of interaction will result in more output and interaction? Right? Would it be the first one? You've got your native speaker and non-native speaker, like we saw in our example with the duck and the truck. Or would it be something more like a non-native speaker and a non-native speaker would have more output and interaction? Why don't you pause while you think of that and make your choice, right? Make your choice, and then when you have a choice that you're 100% on, this is my answer, then you can hit pause again and let it play. All right, everybody's thinking, and ding. Okay, so this is according to research that shows, and you could even think of it intuitively, like if you've been around other non-native speakers using English, if you've been around native speakers using English, particularly at the lower level of proficiency, sometimes a native speaker is not really helping. Why? Well, when one of the interlocutors, that's just the people talking, right? The people interacting. When one of them is a native speaker, that can actually result in less output and interaction between the two speakers. Why is that? Well, the non-native speaker, particularly at the lower levels, they often hesitate to speak out of fear of making mistakes. There's the scary Englishman or whatever, right? And so they don't want to make grammar mistakes. Think of Krashen's monitor, right? So in other words, the native speaker can become a hindrance to communication. And you're going to see this idea again in ICC class. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, hey, I don't mind talking to you, Dave. When we're around, I feel like I can say a lot to you. And that could be true, but not every native speaker is an English teacher. Not every native speaker is invested in your proficiency. Even some teachers, I'm falling into it now, excuse me, in this lecture format, but they will do most of the talking, so there's less interaction, as you know. Anyway, just an interesting thought going forward, because think of your own role as an English teacher, as a non-native but expert English speaking teacher, right? You can have that empathy with your students, and you could have an environment where there's a lot of output and interaction, right? Hopefully they won't be scared of you. That's the key. So what can you tell parents when they complain about mixed level classes? And where is this coming from? This comes from some teachers have experienced that a parent will come in the Hagwon, for example, and the parent will say, you know what, I don't want my kid talking to the other kids. I want him talking to that native speaking teacher, because they're not going to learn from the other kid. They're not going to develop their language from the other kid. I want them talking to the native speaking teacher. Well, what would you say based on this? What would you say to that parent? Well, hopefully you would say something like, not thank you. You would say something like, well, actually, the studies show that When you have a non-native speaker, two non-native speakers talking to each other, there's a lot more output and interaction, and that means that they're negotiating meaning, and my goal is to get them talking more. And so you could tell them something like this. Of course, you could also tell them, nobody wins unless everybody wins. We want everybody to develop in this classroom. All right? Well, at this point, I'm going to say thank you very much for watching this video. I know it's not easy. You have several videos to watch. But it's a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the classroom. Bye-bye. Oh, I almost forgot. What's your homework for next week? Well, your homework for next week, if you look in your SLA books, your homework is phonology and pronunciation. So please read those student book pages that are indicated in your student book. And actually the pages are coming from Scrivener this time. So look at page 6 of your SLA student book for that information. And don't forget to turn in your digital resource analysis. All right, everyone. See you in the classroom.